There's something quietly unsettling about the day we were born. A date marked on calendars celebrated with candles and wrapped gifts, yet beneath that harmless ritual lies something older and far less innocent. You didn't choose when you arrived. You were pulled through the veil of time by forces unknown. Before you had a name, before you formed a memory, something in the world had already chosen your entrance, your season, your light, your surrounding silence or storm. Most people never question this. They think their birthday is just a number. But Carl Jung didn't. He believed your birth carried a psychic signature, an invisible imprint, shaped not only by biology, but by the symbolic forces alive in that moment of time. Not astrology, not superstition, but archetypal energy, the language of the unconscious, echoing through the seasons, the myths, and the turning of the earth itself. Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." This video is not about birthdays. It's about awakening. Because the truth is, the month you were born into carries more than just a temperature or a mood. It contains a pattern, a myth you've been living without realizing it, a shape that formed around your soul before your conscious mind ever arrived. And if you felt out of place, if you've struggled to understand yourself or felt like your life has followed strange emotional currents you couldn't explain, then maybe you've been carrying an archetype you never knew was yours. Something inherited not from your parents, but from the symbolic atmosphere of time itself. The world doesn't speak to us in words, it speaks in symbols. In winter's hush, in summer's defiance, in the longing of autumn, in spring's rebirth. And each month is not just a passage of days, but a psychological mirror shaped by light and dark silence, and growth, reflection, and desire. Jung saw these not as poetic metaphors, but as actual living patterns of the unconscious archetypes that live inside every one of us. They are not roles we perform. They are inner gods we unknowingly serve. And your birth month may reveal the God you've been bowing to your whole life. Think back to your earliest memories. Were you quiet, observing, carrying a sense of weight you couldn't name? Or were you fiery, always beginning, always fighting? Maybe you always longed to create harmony, or felt torn between inner conflict and outer peace. Maybe without knowing why, you've always felt like an outsider or a bridge between two worlds. These are not just personality traits. They are archetypal blueprints, the inner patterns that shape how you feel love, struggle, and transform. And they may have been with you since birth. Jung believed that the unconscious does not emerge from chaos, it mirrors nature. And nature is not random. It is cyclic, patterned, and deeply symbolic. The month of your birth may contain a silent rhythm that you've been moving to your entire life. That rhythm is not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you who you are or what you must become, but it offers a myth. And if you know your myth, you begin to reclaim your story. You begin to see that your confusion, your desires, your self-doubt, even your pain, may all be echoes of a deeper symbolic current you were never taught to name. This is why Jung's work with archetypes matters. Because the archetype you were born with, whether it's the sage, the warrior, the reborn, or the alchemist, isn't just a poetic image. It's a mirror of your psychological instincts, your emotional seasons, your inner weather. And recognizing it is not about self-definition. It's about self-revelation. You don't become your archetype. You realize you've always been it. But until you see it, you live in confusion. You blame yourself for being too much or not enough. You fight battles that aren't yours, chase dreams that exhaust you, and wonder why your life doesn't feel like your own. That's because you've been living without a map. And archetypes, as Jung wrote, are the innate psychic structures that shape the way we perceive the world. They are the maps written in your blood, your breath, your fears, and your longings. And your birth month may be the first clue to decoding the map you were born with. This isn't destiny. It's not prediction. It's a symbolic framework, one that helps you begin asking the right questions. Not who am I, but rather what is the pattern I've been unconsciously serving? What inner God have I unknowingly made sacrifices to? Because once you see the pattern, you're no longer bound to it. You can integrate it. And in doing so, you begin the path Jung called individuation, the slow, courageous journey toward becoming whole. But to walk that path, you must first see the forces that have shaped you. You must stand still in silence and ask, what did I carry into this world the moment I was born? What psychological season gave birth to my nature? What myth am I living? And what happens if I continue to live it unconsciously? In the next part, we will walk month by month, not through facts, but through symbols, through psychological seasons and emotional archetypes, and perhaps in one of them, you will begin to recognize your own soul's hidden story, the one that's been whispering to you beneath every thought, every pattern, every longing you've never been able to explain. Let's begin with a truth that sounds too strange to believe, yet feels eerily familiar once heard. You were born into a story that was already being told. The archetype you carry didn't begin with you. It is older than your name, older than your childhood, older than your wounds. It stretches back through myth, through ancestral memory, through the collective unconscious that Jung believed connects every human soul. You didn't invent the patterns you live, you inherited them. The month of your birth is not a sentence, but a symbol, one that contains a psychic flavor, an emotional undercurrent, a set of invisible instructions whispered through time. Carl Jung saw these archetypal energies reflected in nature's turning in the psychological significance of seasons. And because each month lives within a specific emotional and symbolic atmosphere, it becomes a mirror of the inner world. This is where meaning begins, not with labels, but with patterns. Let's walk through them now slowly, as if walking through your own forgotten memories. January, the elder. The sage. A birth beneath the cold sky, wrapped in winter's stillness. People born in January often carry the weight of introspection early. They seem older than their years. They watch more than they speak. Not because they are shy, but because they are gathering something deeper than information. They are gathering wisdom. For them, silence is not absence, it is depth. But the shadow of the sage is isolation. A life too heavy with thought can grow cold. The lesson here is balance, to remember that wisdom does not replace wonder, it deepens it. February, the visionary, the revolutionary. The quiet rebel who sees what others cannot. February-born souls are touched by future thinking, by change, by ideas that feel too soon for the world around them. They often feel out of place, not because they are broken, but because they were born to reimagine. They are not here to preserve tradition, they are here to disrupt it. But disruption without grounding leads to madness. The task for the visionary is to build roots deep enough to carry their visions into the real world. March, the reborn. The awakener. A birth that bridges winter and spring, between death and renewal. Those born in March live close to emotional truth. Sensitive, intuitive, and often spiritually inclined, they carry the scent of resurrection. They are not afraid to transform, to lose themselves, and begin again. But this constant rebirth can feel like instability. The reborn must learn to stay, not to flee when things grow still, not to fear what does not change. Their gift is emotional resurrection, but their power lies in integration. April, the warrior, the initiator, the archetype of fire and emergence. April-born individuals are often bold, passionate, and hungry for life. They act, they lead, they begin. There's an urgency in them, a fire that cannot be contained. But fire without direction burns everything. The warrior must learn patience, emotional control, and the power of pause. They are here to act with purpose, not with impulse. When balanced, they become unstoppable forces of creative change. May the builder, the lover of form. This is the archetype of sensuality, stability, and the quiet devotion to what is real. Those born in May often crave beauty, comfort, and consistency. They are the ones who turn chaos into structure. Their power is in embodiment, the ability to make things last. But they can become too rooted, too attached, afraid of anything that threatens their peace. Their path is learning that true security is internal, not external, and that sometimes the soul must risk peace to grow. June, the seeker, the messenger, a child of light and movement. June-born souls often possess quick minds, restless hearts, and a deep hunger for meaning. They explore everything, ideas, people, experiences. But their gift is not just curiosity, it's connection. They weave insights together. They speak the unspeakable. Yet their shadow is distraction. The seeker must learn to focus, to choose depth over novelty, and to realize that some truths are only found by staying in one place long enough to hear them. Already you may be seeing yourself reflected in one of these mirrors. Or perhaps your archetype has been hidden, buried beneath years of adaptation and survival. But let this be clear, these archetypes are not fantasies. They are emotional blueprints. They don't define your fate, but they reveal your original posture toward life, the stance your soul assumed when it entered this world. These archetypes are not things you become, they are things you remember. They are fragments of your deep self waiting to be seen, not as flaws or quirks, but as symbols, as signs of a story much larger than your personal history. Jung believed that meaning comes not from changing who we are, but from learning how to relate to it differently, from seeing our life symbolically. In the next part, we will explore the remaining months from July to December, each carrying its own emotional tone, mythic weight, and psychological echo. And as we descend into the darker months, we also descend into deeper questions about love, power, memory, transformation, and mortality. The archetypes of these months will not only show you who you are, but what you're here to face, and perhaps what you were born to redeem. Now we cross into the second half of the calendar, the months that follow the year's apex, and symbolically, they represent the descent into depth. These are not just colder, darker months. In a physical sense, they carry psychological shadows, emotional truths, and invitations to transformation. In Jung's view, the outer cycles of nature mirror the inner cycles of the soul. What begins in light must eventually return to the dark, not as punishment, but as initiation. And for those born in these months, their archetypes often reflect that deeper pull toward meaning, emotion, and rebirth. July, the nurturer, the protector. Born in the heart of summer, July souls often radiate warmth, emotional depth, and an instinctive need to care for others. They are the quiet center in times of crisis, the ones who hold the emotional weight of families, friendships, and communities. But behind this nurturing lies a challenge, the danger of self-forgetting. July-born individuals often neglect their own needs, numbing their pain by focusing on others. They must learn the difference between love and sacrifice, between compassion and codependency. Their path is to remember that protecting others begins with protecting the self. August, the sovereign, the leader, the one born into the full light of the sun. August carries the archetype of command, identity, and creative power. Those born in August often have a magnetic presence. They lead without effort, and when healthy, they lead with heart. But leadership carries a shadow. The sovereign may fall into control, pride, or isolation. They feel the weight of responsibility even when they never asked for it. Their growth lies in realizing that true leadership is not about power over others, but power within the courage to remain authentic even when unseen. September, the analyst. The architect, the one who organizes the chaos. September-born individuals carry the archetype of order, of logic, refinement, and structure. Their minds are precise. Their hearts are quietly disciplined. They are often the ones who notice what others miss, the subtle inconsistencies, the patterns beneath the noise. But this clarity can become a prison. The analyst can turn into the perfectionist. And perfection, as Nietzsche warned, is often a disguise for fear. The fear of being exposed, of being human. Their journey is to surrender, to let go of control, and find peace in imperfection. October, the diplomat. The artist. October carries a special tension, the meeting of opposites. Light and dark, warmth and cold. It is a month of beauty and contradiction, and those born under it often embody both. October-born souls seek balance. They hate conflict but feel everything. They long for unity in art, in love, in life. They are natural bridge builders, but they pay a price for harmony. They often silence their truth to avoid tension. Their path is learning that true peace is not found in avoidance, but in authenticity and the courage to be whole, even if it means breaking the surface calm. November, the alchemist. The transformer. A month of mystery endings and unseen depths. Those born in November carry a psychological intensity. They don't just experience life, they feel it. Pain, passion, fear, desire. Nothing is superficial to them. They are drawn to what lies beneath, unafraid to face what others avoid. These are the souls who walk through fire, not because they want to suffer, but because they know that suffering reveals truth. But the danger of the alchemist is destruction without rebirth. If they don't transform their wounds, they recycle them. Their power lies in their capacity for resurrection, to make gold from ruin, to find meaning in the ashes. December, the sage. The philosopher, the one born in the year's last breath. December is symbolic of reflection, of inner light, of perspective beyond the moment. Those born in December often carry a quiet wisdom. They ask questions others fear. What is the purpose? What is lasting? What is real? They think in symbols. They feel in myths. But their detachment can also become avoidance. The sage may live too much in thought, too far from the world. Their path is not to escape reality, but to illuminate it, to translate the eternal into the everyday. To live their ideals, not in theory, but in presence. As we move through these 12 archetypes, a strange realization begins to surface. These are not 12 types of people. They are 12 faces of the same human soul. Each of us carries all of them. But one came first. One entered the room with us when we were born, and it may have shaped everything: how we love, how we defend ourselves, how we dream, and how we fall apart. That is the haunting truth of Jung's insight, that the archetype you were born under is not a mask, but a mirror. And when you begin to recognize it, not as a label, but as a symbolic echo of your emotional terrain, you stop trying to fix yourself, and you begin to understand yourself. You begin to see the divine rhythm in your failures, the myth in your breakdowns, the meaning inside your confusion. In the next and final part, We'll explore what it means to live with your archetype consciously and what it costs to live without it. We'll face the real question this entire journey has been leading toward. What happens when you finally realize that you've been living someone else's story, or worse, living your own, but without ever knowing what it meant? Now you know. The archetype wasn't a fantasy. It was a present, silent patient watching you from the very beginning. It shaped your instincts before you could name them. It filtered your perception before you understood what perception was. And whether it was the sage, the warrior, the nurturer, or the alchemist, it didn't arrive later in life. It was life. You were living inside it. But you didn't know. Not until now. This realization can feel like a homecoming or a confrontation, because once you see the archetype, you also see everything it touched. The way you handled pain, the roles you slipped into without consent, the emotional armor you mistook for personality. You begin to notice the patterns, not the obvious ones, but the ones behind the ones. Why you're drawn to certain people, why certain wounds keep reopening, why you feel like you've been repeating the same scene in different costumes. That's the archetype. Not controlling you, but echoing through you. And the longer it remains unconscious, the more your life feels like someone else's handwriting. Carl Jung warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Most people never make it that far. They live according to the archetype, but without the awareness of it. They follow the myth, but they think they're being original. They carry the same emotional burdens, generation after generation, calling it personality, calling it temperament, calling it just how I am. But you are not your patterns. You are the one watching the pattern, and that means you can rewrite it. Here's the secret no one tells you: your archetype is not here to define you. It's here to awaken you. It is a doorway, not a prison. Once you name it, once you face its light and shadow, it becomes something else entirely, not a god you serve, but a guide you listen to. That's the threshold Jung called individuation. It's when the unconscious is no longer dragging you by the ankles, but walking beside you. And when you reach that place, when you live with your archetype consciously, life begins to feel yours. You no longer act from compulsion. You respond from clarity. You no longer chase things just to fill a silence. You understand what that silence was trying to teach you. You begin to treat your life as myth, not in the sense of fiction, but in the sense of meaning. And that changes everything. Because once your suffering becomes symbolic, it stops feeling random. Once your desires are seen as archetypal, they stop feeling shameful. And once your past is held with awareness, it stops feeling like a mistake. But if you ignore this, if you continue living as though your birth was accidental, as though the patterns are just coincidences, as though the emotional tone of your life is just mood or trauma or chance, then you will live disconnected. You'll feel like you're constantly missing something you can't name. You'll change partners, change cities, change goals, and wonder why nothing changes inside you. Because you're not fighting the world. You're fighting a pattern you never saw, a story you never realized you were in. So now we return to the beginning. Your birth month, a single point in time, a silent doorway, and behind it, a symbolic force. Not a superstition, but a psychic rhythm. A deep, mythic current that has been shaping the background of your life from the moment you arrived. You don't have to believe in it, but feel it. Look back at your history, your emotional climate, the roles you fell into, the fears you couldn't explain. What if they weren't random? What if they were clues? This is the invitation Jung leaves us with to reclaim the archetype, to meet it in the open, to no longer be haunted by it, but to walk with it, to let it inform but not imprison, to integrate its wisdom and outgrow its compulsions. Because the archetype you were born with isn't the whole of who you are. It's only the first chapter. What you write next is up to you. But the pen only begins to move once you awaken. The power of symbolic time. Why your birth month is a spiritual mirror. There are questions you stop asking after a while. Not because you found the answer, but because asking them started to feel dangerous. One of those questions is simple, almost innocent. Why was I born when I was not how? Not where, not to whom, but when? We've been taught to think of time as neutral, linear, unemotional, just numbers on a calendar. But what if that's a lie? What if time isn't empty but alive? What if your birth month wasn't a coincidence, but a mirror? Not in the sense of fortune-telling or astrological forecasts, but something deeper. Symbolic, psychological, archetypal. What if the exact moment you entered this world marked you with an unseen rhythm, a psychic imprint made not of stars, but of seasons' energy and collective meaning? Carl Jung did not see time as empty. He saw it as patterned. Just as the psyche has archetypes, so does time. Each month, each season is not just a phase of weather, it's a carrier of psychic energy. Time is not just what moves forward, it is what holds symbolic memory. When you were born, you didn't just enter space, you entered a moment. A specific emotional and spiritual atmosphere. You emerged through a portal of time that was already humming with certain patterns, certain energies. And you've been carrying its echo ever since. This is not a mystical belief. It is a symbolic one. Jung believed that the unconscious is not random. It mirrors the archetypal structure of the cosmos. In the archetypes and the collective unconscious, he wrote that archetypes are the living system of reactions and aptitudes that determine the individual's life in invisible ways. Now consider that. If archetypes live inside us and are mirrored in nature, then time itself is not passive. It is expressive. It holds meaning, just like myths, just like dreams, just like symbols. That means the moment of your birth, down to the month, holds symbolic weight. You were not just born into the world. You were born into a season of energy, a psychological landscape already in motion. Winter does not carry the same symbolic truth as spring. Autumn does not speak to the soul the way summer does. These are not poetic ideas. They are truths the body remembers even when the mind forgets. Cold births resilience, heat births expression. Transitions like March or September birth, complexity, duality, contradiction. You may never have thought about this. But what if the emotional tone of your life, the way you move through relationships, through self-image, through struggle, is partially shaped by the invisible mood of your beginning? Think about it. Maybe you've always been a little melancholic, not sad, just contemplative. Maybe you feel things more deeply in silence, or maybe you've always been in motion. Starting pursuing, erupting with energy that feels too much even for you. Or maybe you've always lived in tension, needing peace, but constantly being pulled into complexity. These are not random traits. They are emotional climates, psychological seasons. And they often reflect the symbolic atmosphere of the month you were born into, not in a deterministic sense, but in a mythic one. Your birth month may be a spiritual mirror, because time is not just chronological. It is archetypal. It reflects something, reveals something. Each month is a passage in the larger story of the year, just as each phase of your life is a passage in your own myth. Jung believed that to understand ourselves, we must look inward through symbols, not outward through definitions. The ego craves data. The soul craves meaning. And your birth month may hold more meaning than you ever realized. But here's the part no one tells you. This mirror doesn't show you who you are. It shows you what you came through. It reveals the energetic doorway you crossed when you entered life. And that doorway, that symbolic season, can illuminate things you've always felt but could never name. It can reveal the emotional patterns you inherited, the roles you stepped into without understanding why, the fears that visit you at night, and the longings that won't go away. It's not about believing your fate was sealed in January or August. It's about realizing that every moment of time carries a psychological resonance, and that resonance may have been with you from the very beginning. Jung taught us to see beyond the literal, to look through reality, not just at it. And time, when seen symbolically, becomes a sacred text. Each month a chapter, each season a teaching. And your birthday, it's a line in that text, a single phrase that echoes across the pages of your life. In the next part, we will explore how each month of the year carries its own symbolic atmosphere, its own archetypal energy, and how that energy may live inside you, whether you've been aware of it or not. Not to reduce you, but to reflect you. Not to confine you, but to reveal the mirror you were born through. Close your eyes for a moment. Forget the calendar, the ticking clock, the artificial names we give to time. Instead, feel it. The shift in light. The air becoming colder or heavier or more alive. Feel the difference between the hush of winter and the burst of spring. The way summer stretches with intensity, or the way autumn folds into itself with quiet grief. Now ask yourself, if time feels this way in your body, what might it have imprinted on your soul the moment you arrived? Jung saw the world through symbolic eyes. To him, nature and psyche were not separate. The outer world reflected the inner world, a principle he called synchronicity. Meaning was not imposed on life. It was already there, waiting to be read. In this symbolic framework, each month, each phase of nature's unfolding mirrors an archetypal truth. And just as myths carry emotional messages beneath their surface, so too does time. If you were born in July, you did not simply enter summer. You entered into the emotional language of warmth, of protection, of belonging, but also of self-neglect, overgiving, emotional fusion. If you were born in November, you arrived through a gateway of death and transformation, the archetypal descent into darkness. That descent might echo in your need for depth intensity or your refusal to live on the surface. Let's look closer. January is not just cold. It is still. Reflective. It carries the energy of the sage, of restraint, of wisdom, of starting inward. Those born in January often walk with a heaviness of thought, the quiet dignity of isolation. But there's danger in carrying too much silence. The world may never ask what you need, and you may never remember to speak. March is the month of awakening the thaw between death and life. People born here often carry a tension between longing and emergence. They feel things deeply. They sense things before they understand them. Their challenge is to trust life's rebirth without being overwhelmed by its fragility. May bring stabilization, sensuality, beauty in form. May-born souls often carry a love for the tangible nature ritual, comfort the sacred in the ordinary. But in their search for peace, they may resist necessary change. They must learn that growth doesn't always feel safe. August is archetypal fire, expression, visibility. It holds the energy of sovereignty, of presence power, the ability to guide. But what happens when the world does not affirm that power? Many born in August struggle between confidence and control, between authentic authority and the need to dominate or retreat. They must learn to lead from within, not through image, but through integration. Each month then carries a symbolic signature, not fixed traits, but emotional weather, the atmosphere your soul walked into when it crossed into life. To Jung, this is not mysticism. This is psychology at its symbolic core. When we ignore the symbolic nature of time, we ignore a part of ourselves that has always been speaking. And the voice of that part is quiet. You hear it in the way you respond to endings, in how you feel during transitions, in what parts of the year seem to reflect you more than others. There's a reason you feel more alive in certain months, or more lost. There's a reason you fall in love with autumn, or dread the arrival of spring. These responses are not random. They are memory. Your psyche remembers the season you were born in, not in language, but in energy, in emotional rhythm, in inner alignment. But here's the thing, you don't have to believe in symbolic time for it to shape you. Just like you don't have to remember being born for it to have changed everything. The symbolic atmosphere of your birth month is not a sentence. It's a mirror, a place where your soul first saw itself reflected through weather, through light, through energy. And that reflection became your first psychological template. You've been referencing it ever since. To live unconsciously is to forget the language of symbols. To live consciously is to remember that every part of your existence has meaning, not because someone told you so, but because your own life keeps revealing it over and over again, if only you'll pay attention. In the next part, we will go deeper into this symbolic map, exploring how the rhythm of time, once made conscious, becomes not just a reflection of who you are, but a guide towards who you're becoming. There is a quiet violence in forgetting where you came from, not geographically, not culturally, but symbolically. Most people never return to the emotional landscape of their beginning. They live forward without realizing they're being pulled backward by a pattern. But time does not forget you. Symbolic time waits. It waits for the moment when you are finally still enough to feel it again, to recognize that the way you enter life sets the tone for how you move through it. If you were born in September, you entered a world leaning into order, the quiet preparation of harvest, the analytical mind of transition. You may feel an instinct to refine, to make sense of chaos, to earn love through perfection. The symbolic mirror here is not of flawlessness, but of structure. Yet, if that structure becomes a cage, the psyche starves. Jung warned that perfection belongs to the gods. The most we can hope for is wholeness. September's task is to replace control with integration, to let go of the myth that being flawless will protect you from being abandoned. October carries the archetype of balance, the bridge between light and shadow. If you were born here, you may have always felt pulled between opposites, beauty and depth, peace and tension, self and other. Diplomats of the soul. October-born individuals long to make harmony, but often lose themselves in the process. Their mirror is a lesson in boundaries that peace built on self-erasure is not peace, but collapse. Their spiritual journey is to stand at the center of contradiction and not flinch. Those born in November are marked by dissent not in value, but in depth. This is the month of transformation, of death in nature, of things falling away. To be born in November is to carry the energy of the alchemist, one who does not fear darkness, because they know that darkness contains truth. These people are not too intense. They are mirrors of the hidden. Their gift is emotional truth, but only if they stop hiding from their own. If they do not transform their pain, they transmit it. Their birth month reminds them suffering is not the end of the story. It is the furnace of evolution. December, the end of the cycle, reflects the archetype of the sage. Those born here often carry a timelessness, a philosophical eye, a deep sensitivity to what transcends. But this perspective can become dissociation. Thought becomes a shelter from feeling. Distance becomes safety. These are the ones who have seen too much too early. Their birth month whispers not of endings, but of reflection. Their gift is to bring eternal truths down into the present moment, to translate what is sacred into what is lived. But only if they dare to be fully here. These aren't personality descriptions. They are invitations. Spiritual mirrors are not meant to define you. They are meant to confront you. Your birth month doesn't tell you who you are. It shows you the emotional field you entered, the symbolic weather that may still live in your nervous system, your habits, your unconscious expectations. Jung believed that becoming whole meant facing not only your inner contents, but the environment in which they were first formed. And time, symbolic time, is part of that environment. When you were born, something more than biology was happening. The world was in a certain mood. A specific energy filled the air. Nature was speaking in archetypes, and you arrived in the middle of one. That archetype may have stayed with you. You may be repeating it, or you may be running from it. But either way, it is alive. And when you finally turn toward it, not as superstition, but as symbol, you begin to reclaim the story you've been living without a name. In the final part, we'll face the deeper implication. If your birth month holds symbolic truth, if time itself is a mirror, then what does it mean to live against that mirror? What is lost when you reject the emotional rhythm you were born into? And what opens when you embrace it not as destiny, but as dialogue? You were never meant to copy someone else's rhythm. Yet most people do. They abandon their original atmosphere, their symbolic origin, in search of something louder, more acceptable, easier to explain. And in doing so, they sever the thread that connects them to their inner myth. They forget the spiritual mirror they were born through, the psychological tone of their entrance, the archetypal hum that was playing in the background as they took their first breath. But forgetting does not erase. It only distorts. And over time, the further you drift from your symbolic nature, the more your life begins to feel like a performance. This is the silent crisis of modern identity. We don't know where our emotional patterns come from. We feel too much or too little, and we blame ourselves. We lose interest, feel disconnected, chase purpose without a compass because something deep inside us is not being mirrored back. Jung understood this disconnection as a loss of symbolic life, a life stripped of myth, of rhythm, of inner meaning. And when that mirror is lost, the psyche suffers, not with obvious symptoms, but with quiet ones. Restlessness, guilt, without cause, the chronic sense that you are not quite in the right life. So ask yourself what might happen if you return to your origin symbolically, not with nostalgia, but with presence. What might you find if you stopped seeing your birth month as a meaningless fact and instead viewed it as a spiritual metaphor? What if it offered you a language to explain why your energy moves the way it does? Why you respond to loss or love or solitude the way you do? What if you were never meant to follow the tempo of the world, but to remember your own symbolic time does not demand belief? It invites observation. It speaks not through logic, but through reflection. Jung never asked us to accept archetypes as facts. He asked us to notice them as patterns, as myths, as repeating motifs in our lives. Your birth month may be one of those motifs. Not a command, but a code. One that, when deciphered, can bring coherence to what once felt chaotic. Because once you understand the symbolic atmosphere you were born into, You begin to see your past differently. You begin to forgive parts of yourself you thought were flaws, realizing they were just reflections of your original season. You stop demanding that your soul bloom in winter or stay quiet in summer. You begin to synchronize your inner life with its natural rhythm, and in that harmony meaning returns. But if you refuse this mirror, if you insist that time is empty, that symbols are illusions, that your emotional patterns have no origin, then you will stay trapped in a loop that isn't even yours. You will carry shame for instincts you never chose. You will measure yourself by a standard you were never built for. You will drown in a tempo that does not match your soul, and you will call that failure, when really it was just misalignment. This is your reckoning, to look into the mirror of symbolic time, to see what season raised your spirit, what atmosphere marked your soul, what rhythm has been breathing beneath your life all along. And to ask the most frightening question of all, what if I stopped resisting it? Because if you do, if you let yourself live in alignment with your symbolic truth, not as a script, but as a rhythm, everything changes. You begin to move with yourself. Your emotions stop feeling random. Your memories begin to teach, and time becomes sacred again. This is the hidden power of symbolic time. Not to tell you who to be, but to reflect who you've always been. Not to impose a fate, but to awaken the forgotten music of your soul's arrival. And once you hear it again, you'll know you were never late. You were never early. You arrived exactly when your story was ready to begin. Born under an archetype. How Carl Jung decoded the calendar of the soul. There's a moment in every life that goes unnoticed, a moment so quiet, so ordinary, we never think to question it. The moment we're born. Not the medical event, not the cry or the cut of the cord, but the deeper invisible crossing. The shift from timelessness into time. You entered this world not just in a place, but in a moment. A specific point on the calendar heavy with atmosphere. The light looked a certain way. The air carried a certain tension or tenderness. The earth was either growing or dying. And whether you realized it or not, your soul felt it. Before you had language, before you could form memory, something in that moment marked you. Carl Jung believed that our entrance into the world isn't arbitrary. He saw time not as mechanical but symbolic, alive with archetypal energy. In his view, each season, each month carries a unique psychological tone, a rhythm that echoes not only in nature, but in the unconscious. You were not just born into a family, a nation, or a name. You were born under an archetype, a timeless pattern hidden within the psychic fabric of your birth month. This isn't astrology. It's not superstition. It's symbolic psychology, a language the soul speaks fluently even when the ego forgets. Jung wrote that archetypes are the inherited possibilities of human imagination. They are not myths we believe. They are myths we live. And time, symbolic time, mirrors those myths. Winter mirrors the sage. Spring reflects the reborn. Summer pulses with sovereignty. Autumn carries the analyst and the alchemist. These aren't just poetic metaphors. They are emotional landscapes. And when you entered this world, you stepped into one. But here's the tragedy. We don't teach people to listen to symbolic time. We teach them to measure it. We reduce it to productivity deadlines, clocks, and birthdays. But your birth date was never just a fact. It was an initiation into a psychic rhythm that may still be shaping how you feel, how you love, how you break down, and how you rebuild. Most people live inside an archetype without ever recognizing it. They feel restless, disconnected, misaligned, not realizing they've been moving to a rhythm that was set the moment they arrived. So ask yourself, have you ever felt like your personality didn't come from your choices, but from somewhere older, deeper, nameless? Have you ever caught yourself repeating emotional patterns you can't explain? Or felt drawn to certain roles, moods, or atmospheres that seem woven into your very nature? You might not be broken. You might just be living inside an archetype you never knew you were born under. A pattern that predates your memory, but shapes your every move. Jung understood this well. In the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he proposed that archetypes aren't created by culture, they are discovered through it. They rise through myths, dreams, and behaviors repeating endlessly in new forms. And if archetypes appear in everything we touch, our stories, relationships, careers, fears, then why would time be any different? Why would the moment of your birth not also carry its own myth? When Jung looked at time, he saw symbols. January was not a blank page. It was the elder's silence. May was not just spring in bloom, it was the builder's devotion. October was not a leaf-falling cliché, it was the diplomat's sorrow and grace. And what's more haunting, he believed that you could trace these psychic climates through people. Their emotions, choices, resistances, all mirroring the archetypal field they were born through. Not because they had to, but because the soul remembers where it came from. In the next part, we'll explore how Jung decoded the calendar of the soul, how each month, each symbolic season contains within it a mythic doorway. And when you recognize the doorway you entered through, you begin to remember the shape of your own story. Not as personality, not as trauma, but as archetype, timeless, sacred, waiting to be made conscious. Think of the calendar not as a tool, but as a mirror, one that reflects the inner atmosphere of your life. Jung didn't see months as empty containers of time. He saw them as expressions of psychic energy. Just as a myth reveals the emotional truth of a culture, a month reveals the emotional truth of a season. And seasons in Jung's symbolic framework are not just changes in nature. They are changes in psyche. In his work with dream symbols and the collective unconscious, Jung began to notice something most people never do, that the unconscious responds to time, not as a schedule, but as a spiritual rhythm. And the moment of birth, far from being random, often aligns with a specific archetypal tone that silently echoes through one's inner world for life. Each month then becomes a kind of mythic doorway, not just what season you were born in, but what story you were born under. To be born in January, for example, is to emerge during the reign of stillness. The external world is cold, silent, and inward. In the symbolic language of Jung, this aligns with the archetype of the elder or the sage. People born under this month often carry the psychological imprint of wisdom, maturity, responsibility, even as children. But wisdom without warmth becomes detachment. Their journey is to remember that knowing is not the same as living. March is a transitional month, the soul's thaw between death and rebirth. Those born in March often live with a dual energy, fragile and intense, intuitive and conflicted. They resonate with the archetype of the reborn, the one who emerges from shadow into light again and again. Life for them is cyclical. They rarely stay the same for long. But transformation without grounding leads to chaos. The challenge is to hold on to something solid while allowing themselves to evolve. June represents the seeker, curious, light-filled, fast-moving. The psyche born here often searches endlessly for connection, novelty, or understanding. But they may struggle with depth or abandon things too quickly. Their spiritual task is to slow down enough to hear what silence has to say. Then we come to August, ruled by the archetype of the sovereign, the one who leads, expresses commands. August-born individuals often carry a strong sense of self, or at least a longing for it. They are marked by presence, not always loud, but known. Their challenge is not to find power, but to carry it with grace. Jung would have called this the integration of the ego and the self, the task of becoming not just a ruler, but a servant of the inner kingdom. But the archetype is never the problem. It's how we relate to it. When we resist the archetype we were born under, we feel fragmented. But when we over-identify with it, we become possessed by it. The sage becomes a recluse, the warrior becomes a tyrant, the nurturer becomes a martyr. This is why Jung insisted on the importance of awareness, of making the unconscious conscious. Because once you see the archetype, you are no longer blindly repeating it. You begin to work with it. You begin to individuate. To Jung, individuation was not the process of becoming someone else, but of becoming who you were always meant to be, beneath the layers of adaptation and confusion. The archetype you were born under is not your identity. It's the first symbol your soul carried into this life. A symbol you must eventually see, question, confront, and integrate. The calendar of the soul is not meant to limit you. It's meant to awaken you. Your birth month doesn't decide your fate. It reveals your starting point at the mythic stage on which your life first began to unfold. And when you return to that moment with open eyes and symbolic understanding, you begin to find meaning in places you once thought were meaningless. You begin to read your own life like a sacred text. In the next part, we will explore the deeper implication of Jung's insight. What happens when you live against your archetype, when you repress, deny, or distort the energy you were born with? And what opens when you return to it? Not to obey it, but to reclaim it as the beginning of your own myth. Most people never meet the archetype they were born under. They meet its shadow. They live inside the tension it creates, the inner restlessness, the emotional gravity, the roles they slip into without thinking. But they don't know where it comes from. They blame themselves. They chase self-improvement. They numb what they don't understand. And so the archetype becomes distorted. Not because it is wrong, but because it is unconscious. To Jung, there was nothing more dangerous than an unconscious archetype. Because it doesn't simply vanish, it possesses. It shows up in projection compulsion and identity confusion. And when that archetype is the one you were born under, the one that shaped your earliest sense of self, it becomes nearly invisible. You don't even know it's there. You think it's just how you are. But how you are might be the echo of a forgotten psychic season, the rhythm of your birth month, playing out in your emotional patterns, your spiritual longings, your hidden fears. Take October, for example, the month of descent and duality. Light fades. The world grows quieter. This is the realm of the diplomat or the artist, those who carry a deep yearning for harmony, beauty, and emotional connection. But in a world that rewards conflict dominance and speed, that archetype is often shamed. October-born individuals may suppress their sensitivity or bend themselves to avoid confrontation, slowly becoming strangers to their own truth. And the soul begins to ache, not for success, but for alignment. Or November, the archetype of the alchemist. Those born here often carry intensity. They don't skim the surface. They descend. They feel everything too much, too deeply, too often. And because of that, they're often told to tone it down, move on, be normal. But their birthright is not normalcy. It's transformation. They are born to burn away what is false in themselves and in others. But if they turn away from this, they become haunted by it. They carry pain without transmutation. They self-destruct instead of self-renew. This is what happens when we lose symbolic connection. We stop recognizing our own archetypal nature. We live in opposition to the rhythm we were born with. And then we wonder why everything feels so off. Why nothing fits. Why we're exhausted by roles that seem right on the surface, but hollow on the inside. Because when we lose touch with our original archetype, we lose touch with our psychic root. And without roots, even growth becomes disorientation. But when we turn back, when we make the unconscious conscious, everything begins to change. We start to see ourselves not as random outcomes of genetics or upbringing, but as participants in a myth that started before we could speak. Jung called this the symbolic life, a life lived with meaning pattern and depth, not controlled by the archetype, but informed by it, guided by it, reclaimed. You begin to notice that your shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of your archetype that hasn't been integrated. You begin to understand that your gifts are not ego achievements. They are expressions of something ancient moving through you. You stop trying to become someone else and instead begin the work of becoming whole. Living symbolically is not about romanticizing your birth month. It's about remembering that the moment you entered this world was meaningful. Not by accident, but by archetype. The atmosphere of that time, its emotional tone, its light, its myth, planted something in you, and you have a choice. You can either ignore it, or you can meet it. Dialogue with it. Work with it. And in doing so, begin to write the rest of your life from a place of awareness, not amnesia. In the final part, we will face the central question that Jung's insight demands: what is lost when you continue living without your archetype, and what is found quietly, deeply, when you reclaim it as your mirror. Your myth, your beginning. You can live your entire life without ever knowing the story you were born into. You can chase success healing, even meaning all while walking in circles around the one truth that could set you free, that you were not just born to someone, but into something. A psychological myth, a symbolic season, an archetypal rhythm. And if you never turn around and face it, you'll spend your life mistaking your symptoms for yourself. Carl Jung didn't ask us to become our archetypes. He asked us to meet them and then integrate them. The archetype you were born under is not your limit. It is your language. It is the doorway you step through into time, and it remains silently as the backdrop of your inner life. If you deny it, it doesn't disappear. It becomes shadow. It warps. And slowly you begin to feel like you're living someone else's life, out of sync with the emotional truth of who you are. What do you lose when you ignore it? You lose clarity. You lose resonance. You start thinking your emotional rhythm is a mistake. You start forcing yourself into patterns that don't fit. And worst of all, you begin to disconnect from the soul. Not in one dramatic moment, but in quiet ones. A sense of being off. A hollow kind of fatigue. A loneliness even in places of connection. That's the cost of archetypal amnesia. But what remains when you return to it? What begins when you make space for the archetype you were born under? A slow remembering. A gentle restoration of inner rhythm. A deepening of self-understanding that doesn't come from self-analysis, but from symbolic alignment. You stop trying to solve yourself like a problem and start seeing yourself like a pattern, a living myth in motion. This is the calendar Jung pointed to, not the mechanical one on the wall, but the calendar of the soul. A symbolic map where each month is a mirror and each archetype is a chapter. When you learn to read that calendar, you stop asking shallow questions about identity. You begin to ask better ones. What was I born carrying? What role have I unconsciously stepped into again and again? What is the myth I've been living? And how do I finish it consciously? You were born under an archetype. And whether you realize it or not, it has shaped the backdrop of your life. But you are not its prisoner. You are its inheritor. And your task, the quiet, lifelong task of individuation, is to bring that archetype into the light, to stop being used by it, and instead to use it consciously as the lens through which you live more truthfully. The moment you were born wasn't just the start of your life. It was the start of your myth. And it's still unfolding, word by word, season by season, symbol by symbol. The question is, will you remain asleep inside it, or will you awaken and begin to live it with your eyes open?